thank you very much. I'm glad to see that you actually read my paper. So that's always, one is never sure with discussants if they're actually just listening to your presentation. So thanks for that. Just at the outset, I might say, well, perhaps my presentation or my paper is slightly ambiguous as well, in line with the general theme of the paper. But certainly, let me try and respond to some of your comments. The first one was, if I understood you correctly, that you said that my argument is made in opposition to neorealism, and you kind of imply that neorealism is not really a foreign policy theory. And well, I have a problem with that, because I know a lot of neorealists say that, and people who talk about foreign policy, but in fact, what is neorealism then? Because it's ultimately, I mean, if we're talking about international relations, it largely comes down to foreign policy. So it's in foreign policy cases where theories, I think, are really tested. And in fact, I think we can't get away from it. You again then in a later question, when you said, but South Africa, foreign policy has become more pragmatic, and then you again referred to neorealism as well. So I think it's something that, we can't really get away from. So my argument would be that, scholars say that neorealism is not a foreign policy theory, but I think it ultimately is as well. So that would be my, my reaction there. But I take note of your suggestion that perhaps, for the purpose of my paper, I should be more clear and perhaps frame it in opposition to classical realism or what is it? What is the new version? They just call it new realism, I think. So new classical realism, absolutely. And then this concept of national interest, which I agree with you, that has strong kind of neo-realist undertones. But again, I've got, a problem there, because I think neo-realists like to kind of just co-opt these concepts, and kind of make it their own, and then nobody else is allowed to use it in a different way. But I agree, and I mean, I think it's, perhaps one of the things we also need to do is perhaps come up with an alternative concept. And that's part of this project, I think, that I'm interested in looking towards the developing world for contributing to IR. I think we just accept these, again, these Western and Northern, constructs, without really thinking about how and if they really apply to the developing world. And I think that's a huge part of contributions that can be made from the global south. I mean, Latin America has I think, contributed quite widely to rethinking these concepts and giving them a kind of local flavor, re-articulating them to suit the local context. So that I'm going to take up for the next version of this paper. I'll try to have a different, try and use a different concept. If any of you have any ideas, what could be a good alternative to national interest, please assist me in this matter. The concept of Ubuntu, I think it's absolutely, it can help to explain African peace. I don't know of any studies yet who have done this, so perhaps that's something that you could look into, or I could look into. It's been used more in terms of the peacemaking and the conflict resolution literature. In other words, what is the process which African states use to make peace? But this whole notion of why are there fewer interstate conflicts in Africa? Could this be explained by Ubuntu? I think that's definitely something to look into. And yeah, I mean, obviously, not all Africans, fully promote and support Ubuntu, which is why, otherwise you could say, but if there's this wonderful thing called Ubuntu in Africa, why are there all these problems as well? So obviously, it's a philosophical construct. Then you say South African foreign policy is ambiguous, but it has become more pragmatic. And you argue that one doesn't need identity, the discourse of identity, to explain this, and that you can then, in fact, use, in your words, neo-realist explanations. Well, I would argue with that, because I think South Africa's identity is changing. And so I think its interests are changing. I really think that 10 years ago, our foreign policy was different. It was more normative. It was more driven by human rights and democracy than it is today. And I think that has to do with the fact that our identity and our interests have changed. And of course, neo-realists could not explain that, because according to them, identity and interests are stable, and they never change. Then you said the shift from normative to a pragmatic foreign policy. What's the role of presidential leadership? I think that's incredibly important. Really, these figures of Nelson Mandela in particular, and Thabo Mbeki, very, very important, and I think, under-researched as well in South Africa's foreign policy. scholarship. But again, I think one doesn't have to then disregard the notion of identity, because I think these presidents highlight particular identities. For example, Thabo Mbeki, his focus was on the African identity of South Africa. So I still think that, through their leadership, they tend to highlight or focus on some of these identities. And then with your final point that you said that, well, low participation is not something that's unique to South Africa, that's absolutely true. And we know, unfortunately, in most countries of the world, people are more interested in, tax rises in taxes than they are in, what's going on in other parts of the world. But I think perhaps the problem in South Africa is that even those people who want to influence foreign policy, so even those who are interested in foreign policy, which we know in all countries is a minority, even they have a problem. So it's not like in the US where you have the strong interest group and lobbying culture, which I think has to do largely, again, with the nature of American democracy. The fact that there's accountability due to the electoral system, and that it's relatively easy to access members of the legislature, due to that electoral system. I don't know if you know, but in South Africa we have a closed list proportional representation electoral system, which means there's absolutely no accountability between citizens and the representatives in Parliament. So I think that also just contributes to the fact that, in terms of foreign policy making, there's zero accountability. So I would still argue with you on that point. And then just finally, to a previous point, you mentioned this thing, which I think is a broader question we all have to ask ourselves, who come from states like Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, is, what is it that these states want to do? Do they want to just become part of the club, these exclusive clubs? Is it the dream of South Africa and Brazil to sit on the G20, the G8, and so now the G20 is kind of a second best, option? I don't know, and that's, I think, very important for citizens to think about. What should the role of your state be in international relations? Should Brazil be challenging the global order, or is it okay just for Brazil to become part of the exclusive club of Western wealthy rich nations and then forget about everybody else? I think these are very important questions that we need to consider. So thank you very much for your comments.